Okay, folks, we are back in this book, and we are on 83, the very bottom of page 83. Lincoln just died. We cannot be sure what would have happened if Lincoln had lived, but we do know that Lincoln's combination of qualities was extremely rare. He was, of course, a strong man who could fight for what he believed in, yet he was also a simple, gentle man who understood other people. And most important for a president, he was a clever politician. He knew how to give up less important things in order to persuade people to support him on what was more important. Andrew Johnson, the new president, was in many ways like Lincoln. With no schooling, he began as a poor tailor. He, too, was a self-made man. Like Lincoln, he had been born in the South, and though he came from Tennessee, he had been against secession. When he was a Democratic senator from Tennessee, he was the only Southern senator to support the Union after the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter. Still, in some important ways, Johnson was no Lincoln. He was not good at persuading. He did not know how to use a joke to make a serious point. Just as Lincoln was gentle, generous, and compromising, so Johnson was crude and obstinate. His weakness would not have been serious in an ordinary citizen, but they were disastrous in a president. Congress was not in session when Lincoln was assassinated in April 1865. Many Republicans distrusted Johnson because he had become a Democrat. They had added him to the Republican ticket as their candidate for vice president in 1864 in the hope that he might draw the seceded states back into the Union. Now, when the death of Lincoln had brought Johnson to the White House, the radical Republicans wanted President Johnson to call Congress into special session to make new rules for the South. But he refused. President Johnson would follow the rules already declared by Lincoln, and he alone would decide when the Southern states had satisfied Lincoln's requirements so they could govern themselves. Lincoln's requirements were not too hard for the Southern states to satisfy. By December of 1865, when President Johnson made his first report to Congress, all but one of the old Confederate states had done what Lincoln asked for. The lone exception, Texas, soon came along. Each of these now had its own government in working order. President Johnson responded happily that the Union was restored. But when the congressmen from these southern states came to take their seats in Congress, the radical Republicans shut them out. The radicals controlled the House of Representatives and told them that they were not really congressmen at all, because the southern states were not really states at all. Even if the Confederate states had followed the president's rules, the radicals said the president had no power to make the rules. Only Congress, by which they meant, of course, the radical Republicans themselves, had the power. Their punishing bill, the Wade-Davis bill, had declared what Congress wanted. The South would have to be restored by Congress or not at all. Congress set up its own committee on Reconstruction to make its own plan. Radical Avenger Thaddeus Stevens led the committee. The watchword of Stevens' congressional plan? Force. The watchword was force. The South, he said, was a conquered province, and nobody would be allowed to forget it. Northern troops would be sent to occupy the South. The committee divided the old Confederacy into 5 military districts. The boundaries of the 11 seceded states were not to be respected. Each of the 5 districts would be ruled by a Northern general. The Northern radical Republicans in Congress laid down new rules for building new Southern states. They wished to see the new states designed to keep political control in Republican hands. Some of the radical demands, such as abolishing slavery and giving civil rights to blacks, were just and necessary, but others were not. Worst of all was the radicals' refusal to forgive. They denied many leading citizens in the Old South the right to vote or even to work at their regular jobs. Hungry for power, the radicals wanted to rule the South through a small group of their puppets, and they were anxious to hold the Republican majority in Congress. They were afraid the new Southern congressmen might be against them. Although the radicals said they loved liberty, they really were afraid of it. They were afraid to give political liberty to their old enemies. So what was President Johnson to do? Under the Constitution, he was supposed to enforce the laws of the Congress. Though he believed some of their laws were unwise, he tried to enforce them. But the radicals were out to get Johnson. They could not bear the idea that they might not be able to control the president. So they passed laws that took away powers the Constitution had given to the president. For example, the Constitution made the president the commander-in-chief of the army, but the radicals passed a Command of the Army Act that took away his power to command. They were obviously wanting a fight. They were hoping to tease the president into violating some law that would give them an excuse to have him removed from office. They hoped then that they could seize the powers of the president. But Johnson was careful to obey every law, to follow all the instructions of Congress. Still, there was a limit to his patience. When the radicals passed the Tenure of Office Act, which took away the president's control over his own cabinet, Johnson decided they had gone too far. Johnson had inherited Secretary of War Stanton from Lincoln, but Stanton had become Johnson's enemy and was actually plotting against him. So the president fired Stanton. The Tenure of the Office Act said Johnson didn't have authority to do such a thing. Johnson, meanwhile, believed such a limitation was against the Constitution. In the total scope of things, Stanson's firing was small, but it was big enough to give the radicals the opportunity, and they took it. I know, I have to finish this. Hold on one second. The framers of the Constitution, being wise men, had provided a way to remove a criminal president. But they saw that if they made it too easy to remove a president, opponents would be tempted to use it to get rid of any president they could not beat at the polls. Then every president would live in terror, afraid to do his duty for fear some political enemy would make a crime of it. The Constitution, Article 2, Section 4, says that Congress can remove a president only on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. First, the House of Representatives has to impeach the president. This means a majority vote to support a list of accusations. Then the Senate has to try the president. The Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court presides, but the entire Senate must vote. To remove a president, a mere majority of the Senate is not enough. The framers showed their special wisdom when they required a vote of 2/3 of the members present. When the Senate met on March 30, 1868, to try President Andrew Johnson on the impeachment brought by the House of Representatives, the nation was in breathless suspense. For few really believed that Andrew Johnson had been guilty of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Johnson was a man of rock-ribbed honesty. No one could prove otherwise. Earnestly, he had followed his inaugural oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Perhaps he had sometimes lost his temper or had shown bad judgment or had used language a president should not use. But these were not crimes. His only crime had been that he believed in his duty to obey the Constitution, and he was determined to follow a policy of forgiveness. He could not have satisfied the radicals without surrendering all the powers of the presidency into their hands. On May 16, 1868, when the Senate finally voted, 35 senators voted guilty and 19 not guilty. Those voting guilty were in a large majority, but they had one vote less than the 2/3 required by the Constitution, and so Andrew Johnson remained president. And we are going to actually talk a lot more about this because Andrew Johnson, of course, was the Greenville's president. And just noting that only 2 other American presidents have been impeached since then, Bill Clinton and Donald Trump. And they all went through an impeachment, but none of them were removed as well. Nixon actually would have probably been impeached, but he resigned. And President Johnson was almost impeached, 1868 for the timeline, and President Lincoln was assassinated, 1865. And I'm going to be posting some much more interesting things, but I have a feeling we may do something kind of special with Andrew Johnson on Monday, so stay tuned.